My name is Dan Roodt. I'm a South African author and commentator. I've lived in this country for most of my life, except a short while when I stayed in Europe, in France. But I've read widely about these sorts of issues, ethnic conflicts, and so on. And currently in South Africa, we've had the biggest riots since at least 1922. But the 1922 riots were something completely different in that it was more of a kind of a workers' uprising from the mine workers against the government. And it was mostly white mine workers as well. So you didn't have any racial or ethnic issues at the time. Whereas now, what we've seen over the last week or so has been a very ethnically oriented riot. We've also seen ethnic clashes between Indians and black people from the Zulu tribe in the KwaZulu-Natal province. And the riots themselves were triggered by the arrest and then imprisonment of a former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma. He's been accused of corruption many times. In fact, he's supposed to have about more than 500 corruption charges against him, and he's had those for years. He was also accused of rape at one point, about 10 or 12 years ago, and then the court found him not guilty, but many people think that he was guilty. There's also within the ruling party, the ANC, um, there are factions, and there's one faction supporting Jacob Zuma and another faction supporting the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. And so these sorts of, the riots and the conflict that we've seen in South Africa over the last few weeks, they were also triggered by the tensions within the ruling party itself, and even within the state, because there are rumors that part of the intelligence service actually work for Jacob Zuma and not for the president, and so they were also rumored to be behind some of the actions that Roodt took and some of the attacks on some of the infrastructure and the roads that were closed and factories. Well, first of all, I think amongst his own people, amongst the Zulus, he has a lot of support. He's quite popular there. You could even call him a populist leader. Whereas the current president, he's from a now the Zulus are the most numerous and the biggest tribe in South Africa. They constitute about 25% of the population, and they live mostly in the KwaZulu-Natal province, although some of them live in other provinces as well, especially here in a more industrialized area, which is now called Gauteng, which is around Johannesburg and Pretoria. So there are many Zulus in this area as well.
And are the Zulus the main activists that are looting and burning down South Africa right now? Or
Yes, yes. They are probably the main actors, or especially in the KwaZulu-Natal province. But we've also seen just spontaneous looting from other ethnic groups as well, but mostly black people who have gone over to this kind of behavior, especially in this province. It wasn't only theft and looting, as you say, but also burning down factories and warehouses, and also closing roads and damaging infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and even some of the energy infrastructure. People were, I mean, for example, some of the major fuel companies like Shell and BP, they were closing their installations down in Durban because they were fearing that they would be attacked. and they would try and start some sort of a huge fire by setting the petrol installations and the oil installations alight over there.
And also food
But the
production has stopped.
Yes, exactly. They were also, I mean, and there was one, at least one video where some farms were also burnt down.
Yes, but if you can't have any warehouses, you can't distribute the food. So then you can't really produce any food because it will just go to waste.
Exactly, exactly. And there seems to have been an attempt to create a famine in South Africa by, blocking the distribution of food and also destroying the facilities producing food in the country. But another element that I was going to mention when you asked your earlier question about the current president, he's kind of a president. He was also installed in power by kind of an oligarchical elite, and a lot of the business people supported him and gave him money to bribe people within his own party so that he could become president, so that could become the leader of his own party against Jacob Zuma. So he doesn't really have popular support, which Zuma does. He's got the support from the people around him and the people with money in South Africa who see in him somebody they can control and manipulate, possibly. But there's over the last week or so, I've seen a lot of reports, especially in the business press, where the business people have become completely disillusioned with the current president because he doesn't seem to know what he's doing, and he's not really living up to expectations as far as they are concerned. And his sponsors, who gave him all this money to bribe, various members of his own party and the leaders of the party, and especially the provincial and the regional leaders of the party.
And how does the police and military react to this?
Well, that's also been something that everybody has been commenting about, that the police, in very many cases, just stood by. They didn't do anything. They just watched, looked on as shops were looted, and whole shopping centers were cleaned out and even burnt down. The police wouldn't lift a finger to stop it. Eventually, after a few days, the army was sent in, but they have also been pretty ineffectual. And they did search, and here's also one of the ironies of the situation. Here in Johannesburg, they went to the one black area called Alexandra, and they searched some of the houses there and shacks and so on, and they found a lot of stolen goods. But that's an all black area, so it tells you that, I mean, in any other country, it would be called racial profiling and it would be denounced as racism because supposedly all races steal, except,
Yeah, have the whites behaved
yeah,
in this way at any point in time?
no, not at all. Not a single white has stolen anything. I mean, there was one actual photograph of whites taking stuff, but apparently it's now been established that that picture was from Mexico and it wasn't even taken in South Africa. So, yeah, as far as we know, no white has taken anything. Even though very many whites are also impoverished and, living as they are under these types of discriminatory laws that we've got here preventing white people from getting jobs and even running their own businesses. But no whites have been involved in the criminality and the thefts and the looting at all.
And how does the military react to this? If the police can't do anything, does the military do
Well, they haven't
anything to solve
look.
the situation?
They haven't really contributed much either, and then there are very few of them as well. during the first uh, COVID lockdown, they mobilized about 50,000 troops to make sure that people stayed at home and uh, didn't travel in the country and that sort of thing. But in the first few days, they could only mobilize 2,500 troops, and they did post some of them at certain key points, key installations. For example, we've got a huge petrochemical plant in Secunda, which also produces petrol from coal, and they did post some soldiers over there. And then, yes, they were also in Alexandra and also in Richards Bay. They transported some of them to Richards Bay, which is a harbor on the northern coast of KwaZulu-Natal, which is also a pretty strategic point in that a lot of the minerals and iron ore and coal and so on are exported from there. But apart from that, the army hasn't really stopped anything. In fact, it was up to the people themselves, the public, um, and the businesses themselves to actually try and stop all the looting. And you eventually had members of the public standing guard at shopping centers and shops and in certain suburbs, protecting themselves. And that's where these ethnic clashes in Natal also came about, where some of the Indians in some of the Indian areas, they clashed with the Zulus, and apparently they killed a number of them, about 10 or 20, and images of those corpses lying next to the road and so on were posted on Twitter, and that then inflamed tensions even further among the black people, and they said it was a massacre, the Phoenix Massacre. There was also a Twitter hashtag with that title, Phoenix Massacre. So we've seen, a lot of ethnic tensions coming to the fore as a result of the riots. And yes, and for a few days, um, KwaZulu-Natal was completely cut off from the rest of the country because the main road, the main highway, motorway connecting KwaZulu-Natal to the northern part of the country, the N3, it was closed, and no trucks were running, and it's only been reopened recently. And then immediately, and by that time, people over there were without food as a result of all the looting, and their warehouses and the distribution centers and everything were.
Do you see the looters as political activists or just
I think
opportunists?
they were mostly opportunists. I mean, there was some sort of a political strategy behind it, and as I said, there were these rumors about people within the intelligence service loyal to Zuma playing a role in orchestrating this, because it came about quite suddenly, and they did hit some of these strategic points. But I think mostly it turned into opportunistic looting and criminality, and yeah, a lot of people
But
just
if
took
they
the
were just opportunists,
exactly.
why aren't they just stealing goods and leaving? Why are they destroying the shops also?
Well, we've seen, South Africa has had centuries of this kind of thing, of just destruction, and it's been one of the big problems in this country for centuries that some of these tribal people would just, at certain points, they would, in time, they would just destroy everything around them, and they would attack farms or burn down crops, or so it's something that we've always had, except for maybe some decades in the 20th century when things were more or less under control. But in the 19th century, it was very common. and it's now again, and ever since the countries outside South Africa, promoted tension in the country and showered us with propaganda and also paid people inside the country to rise up against the old government. Then we had a lot of that destruction as well. It was just wanton nihilistic destruction. So we had a combination of theft and just kind of gratuitous destruction and burning during these riots, and but that's not it's not unusual, and you also see it in other countries. Of course, you've seen it in the United States with the whole Black Lives Matter thing. That also was triggered by something, a racial or political event, but eventually it would just become self-serving, and it would just be continue as a destructive nihilistic exercise. So that's what we saw during quite a few days of these riots.
Is it possible to be law abiding and survive in South Africa right now?
Well, probably not, because just prior to these riots, the Minister of Police, Becky Chile, he wanted to pass a new law which would make it just about completely illegal to own any guns, even for hunters and sport shooters and people like that. And during these riots, the only way in which people could protect themselves was through having their own weapons, or even by means of baseball bats and golf clubs and so on. You saw a lot of people walking around with sticks and clubs and golf clubs and baseball bats and so on. So I think after this, now, if they continue with this law, probably a lot of people would refuse to hand in their guns, and then they would be criminalized as well. So in order to survive, you would have to, become, you would have to, contravene the law yourself. Otherwise, you are putting yourself in a very dangerous position.
And how is the political situation right now regarding anti-white sentiments among the other
Well,
races?
I think it was a bit of both in that I think during and especially just after the riots, a lot of the businesses did a lot to. I mean, the government was completely in a state of paralysis. Didn't do anything to stop the riots. During the riots and even afterwards, they didn't do anything to solve the whole food crisis, especially in KwaZulu-Natal. But a lot of the supermarkets and the business people, the people who had suffered during the riots and lost a lot of money, but they actually sent hundreds of big trucks with food to KwaZulu-Natal to restock their shops that had not been burnt down, although hundreds of them were burnt down. And that in that way they stabilized the situation. And of course, so I don't think there was eventually in the aftermath, there wasn't much of an anti-white sentiment on the part of the looters, although they did try to, during the looting and the riots, they did try and instigate this by having anti-white messages distributed. But ironically, I think now it's almost as if the old South Africa is returning, because increasingly a lot of the people and the black people in the country are looking towards the white community for leadership and to save them from this kind of from these sorts of chaotic anarchic events. And people, I think everybody is very disillusioned with the with the current regime, and especially with this president Cyril Ramaphosa. I haven't heard anything good said about him, even by people who previously were quite enamored with him or quite ardent supporters of him.
How do you see the near future? Is South Africa going to improve in the coming years, or is it going to be a total Mad Max society?
I think, well, you see, the thing is that we were all, that's what people from the outside don't realize is that we are already, even when things are sort of normal in abbreviated commas, in quotation marks, then we are already in a Mad Max situation because every day we have looting and theft and attacks, farm attacks, and so on. But it's just that they had, especially in 2008, they had these so-called xenophobic attacks on foreigners from other African countries where they would place a tire around somebody's neck and they would fill it with petrol and then set it alight and the person would be burnt alive. And during the whole during the political conflict in the 1980s, 400 people were executed in that way. And Winnie Mandela famously said, the wife of Nelson Mandela at the time, they got divorced afterwards, but she said at the time that with our matches and our tires, we will liberate this country. And that's exactly what they did. And, violence and intimidation is part of African politics. And this kind of mob violence is often used as a political tool. It was used before 1994, and it's been used after that. And I think Zuma and his supporters are now using it in order to further their political program or to get Zuma back into power. So mob violence is common, and it's something that it's kind of a political method for many people. But as you were saying about the Mad Max situation, yeah, we had a complete Mad Max situation here because there were people. I mean, it was just a complete breakdown of law and order. You had fighting in the streets, especially down in KwaZulu-Natal. You had Indians shooting at blacks, and you know this notion that you could simply follow the American model of mixing people up and giving them some sort of a common over sort of a common umbrella identity based on geography, calling everybody South Africans and so on, and we've got one soccer team and one rugby team and so on. It hasn't worked at all, and people have retained their own ethnic identities. And as soon as something like this happens, as we saw in KwaZulu-Natal, some very old divisions, say between the Indians and the Zulus, come to the fore because in the late 1940s there were similar riots in Durban during which hundreds of Indians were killed. And that's part of their collective memory down there. And these old fears immediately came to the fore during the riots. And I think the same goes for the white population. At one point last week, it felt like war because people were scared. They were really scared, and they were sending messages to one another. And all the images of the violence and the looting and the destruction was circulating, and people stayed indoors. And where we are in a gated community here, we got constant updates from our own security personnel telling us what they were hearing and how they were preparing to face any sort of attack on us. So it was Yes, well, touch wood, we are pretty safe here, but we've got some pretty heavy private security here. And our own security company, they had helicopters in the air most of the time last week. They were also preparing, they were working round the clock, and they were heavily armed. Yeah, and from what I hear, they even had armored vehicles ready, and it was, we were on the verge of having some sort of a civil war at some point last week. So yeah, I mean, and I think these riots are going to have a lasting effect. It's the biggest riots we've ever seen in South Africa, even during the 1980s, when South Africa was being destabilized from outside by countries in Europe, the Soviet Union, East Germany, Cuba, and so on, and we had urban terrorism, 200 terrorist attacks in our own cities. Even at that time, it was not as bad as it was last week. These are the worst riots we've ever had, except for this minor strike in 1922 when several hundred people were killed. But over 200 people have been killed um, so far during these riots, and a lot more injured. And the damage that was done to the shops and distribution centers and factories. They destroyed medical factories as well. Even there's a factory down in Durban where they produce medicine against HIV, against AIDS, because we manufacture a lot of that. Because I think we're the country in the world with the highest level of AIDS in the world, and they even attacked that factory and burnt it down. So, but all of that damage, they're talking about 100 billion rand of insurance claims that are going to come out of this. In euros, that's probably about 6 billion euros, and that's far bigger than anything we've ever seen in the United States, or even the Detroit riot of 1967, or the 1992 riots in Los Angeles when Rodney King was assaulted. Even and the Black Lives Matter riots last year in 2020. Um, this surpasses all of it. I mean, never before have we had riots as big as this, and with so much destruction as we've had over the last week. But now, some of the economists and so on, they're playing this down and they're saying that it's only going to cost us 0.2% of economic growth over the next year or so. But I very much doubt that. I think it's going to affect the country in the long run. Very few people would want to invest in a place where things can go wrong on this scale. And if you're a company, an overseas company, you're investing here, and the next day your entire installation, all your stock and your factory and everything goes up in smoke. Yes, definitely. I think Europe, there are there's similar rioting in Europe, especially in places like France, where they gratuitously burn cars. Apparently every year on the 14th of July, when it's the French national holiday, they burn several hundred or even thousands of cars. And they also do it over New Year. And there regularly are riots in the immigrant suburbs, or the so-called banlieue in France. And we've also seen in Sweden, we've seen riots in Germany, in Belgium, and other places. So I think it's not quite on the same scale as here, but as more and more people from Africa immigrate to Europe, you're going to find the same kind of problem, because it's something that seems to be, and also a kind of sadistic violence. People get attacked and killed or raped. Women get raped and so on. And and often there's no economic motive to that. It's not somebody who's hungry or who's just trying to steal food. He's out to really harm the other person. We see a lot of that, and South Africa is famous for these sadistic farm murders and attacks.